The ghost of laughter and cigar smoke still clung to the air of Blackwood Manor, a stubborn revenant refusing to be banished by the dawn. Eleanor Blackwood stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the library, her silk robe a poor defense against the morning's chill and the cold emptiness that had taken root in her chest 2 years prior. Outside, the January frost had painted the world in shades of silver and white, a stark contrast to the riotous, jewel-toned chaos the house had been just hours before. Her 12th night party. An event her late husband, Arthur, had adored, a tradition she had kept alive out of a sense of duty that had slowly curdled into a strange, masochistic ritual. This year, however, she had twisted the tradition. This year she had decreed it would be a masquerade. Not the gentle, whimsical kind with simple eye masks, but a true Venetian-style spectacle where identities were buried under layers of silk, velvet, and artifice. It had been Arthur's best friend, Alistair Finch, who had raised a skeptical eyebrow when she'd announced it. A masquerade, Eleanor? Is that wise? The potential for misunderstandings. Alistair. Always so proper, so measured. The very embodiment of a starched collar and a meticulously balanced ledger. He had been Arthur's rock, the steady, quiet force beside her husband's booming, sunlit vitality. And since Arthur's sudden passing, Alistair had become her rock, too, a constant, reliable, and utterly predictable presence. He handled the estate's complicated finances, fended off avaricious relatives, and checked in on her every Tuesday and Friday at precisely 4 o'clock. He was a monument to decency, and sometimes in her darkest moments, his unwavering propriety felt like a cage. "Misunderstandings are the point, Alistair," she had replied, a sharp edge to her voice she hadn't intended. "For one night no one is who they are. No one is a widow, a banker, a debtor, or a fool. They are simply desire and mystery." He had looked at her then, a long, quiet look from behind his spectacles, his gray eyes unreadable. He had not approved, but he had, of course, assisted. He was always assisting. Last night, the mystery had been intoxicating. The grand ballroom of Blackwood Manor had swirled with harlequins, pagan kings, gilded birds, and mythological beasts. The air was thick with the scent of champagne, beeswax candles, and a thrilling, dangerous anonymity. Eleanor herself had been the queen of the night, in a gown of deepest obsidian velvet and a mask of intricate silver filigree that covered the upper half of her face, crowned with a headdress of black feathers and tiny winking jet beads. For the first time in 2 years she had not been Lady Eleanor Blackwood, the tragic widow. She had been a silhouette, a whisper, a woman. And she had danced. She had danced with a sun king whose hands were too clammy, with a mischievous Puck who told dreadful jokes, and with a brooding, silent figure dressed as a phantom, whose touch had made her skin prickle with an unwelcome familiarity. But it was the last dance that had undone her. The clock had been striking midnight, the signal for the unmasking, when a man she hadn't seen all night stepped out of the shadows. He was dressed as a Venetian gondolier, but unlike the cheerful, stereotypical costume, his was somber. His mask was a simple, polished black porcelain, expressionless and smooth, covering his entire face. His cloak was dark, his hat pulled low. He didn't speak. He simply offered his hand. And something in the absolute stillness of his stance, the quiet confidence of his gesture, called to the wild, untamed part of her soul that had been hibernating. She took his hand. He didn't lead her to the dance floor, already thinning as guests scrambled to reveal themselves. Instead, he pulled her through a side door, into the relative quiet of the conservatory. The glass ceiling revealed a sky dusted with cold, bright stars. The air was humid, fragrant with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. The distant sounds of the party were a muffled echo. They stopped in the moonlit heart of the room, surrounded by the skeletal shadows of dormant plants. He still held her hand. His grip was firm, warm. "Who are you?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling, not with fear but with a thrilling anticipation. The masked figure said nothing. He simply raised his other hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw with a tenderness that stole her breath. It was a gesture of profound familiarity, yet it was charged with a new, electric current. This was not the comforting pat of a friend. This was the caress of a lover. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of velvet and bone. 2 years of grief, of loneliness, of being seen as a monument to a dead man, crashed over her and then receded, leaving behind a raw, aching need. She leaned into his touch. He bent his head and she rose to meet him. The kiss was not gentle. It was a conflagration. It was the spark that set the dormant tinder of her soul ablaze. It was desperate and hungry, a silent conversation of lips and tongue that spoke of long-suppressed yearning and a recognition that went beyond names or faces. Her hands came up, tangling in the rough wool of his cloak, pulling him closer. The world narrowed to this point of contact, to the taste of wine and winter mint on his lips, to the solid real feel of him. For that one blinding moment she was not a widow. She was a woman desired and desiring. A burst of laughter from the hallway shattered the spell. They broke apart, breathing ragged. Eleanor's mask was askew, her lips swollen. She stared at the blank, black porcelain of his mask, desperate to see the eyes behind it, to know the soul of the man who had just reignited her. "Wait," she breathed as he took a step back. But he didn't. He bowed his head once, a swift, almost formal gesture, then turned and melted back into the shadows of the conservatory, disappearing through a door that led to the garden. Eleanor stood there, trembling, her fingers pressed to her lips. The ghost of his kiss was a brand. She was still standing there when the first of the unmasked, bleary-eyed guests found their way out, laughing and exclaiming over the identities of their fellow revelers. The magic was broken, the night was over. But she carried its secret, burning in her chest. The morning after was a study in stark reality. The grand house was littered with the detritus of celebration. Empty champagne flutes perched precariously on bookshelves, a lone, crumpled glove on the staircase, the faint, sweet smell of spilled wine clinging to the Persian rugs. The staff moved through the rooms with quiet efficiency, their hushed voices and the clatter of cleaning a mundane counterpoint to the symphony of the night before. Eleanor sat in the morning room, attempting to force down a piece of toast that tasted like ash. She had barely slept. Her body hummed with a restless energy, her mind replaying the kiss in the conservatory on an endless, torturous loop. Who was he? The question was a drumbeat in her skull. She ran through the guest list in her mind, the local gentry, Arthur's business associates from London, a few artists and writers she tolerated for the sake of conversation. None of them fit the man in the gondolier mask. His silence, his intensity, his mastery. It was the only word for it. The kiss had not been a question, it had been a statement. The door to the morning room opened and her butler, Higgins, stepped in, his expression as neutral as ever. "Mr. Finch is here, my lady?" Eleanor's heart gave a peculiar lurch. Alistair. Of course. It was Tuesday. 4 o'clock was hours away, but he was nothing if not dependable, and he would, no doubt, want to ensure she had survived the evening. A part of her, the part that still tingled from the stranger's kiss, resented the intrusion. She was not ready for his staid reality to intrude upon her delicious mystery. "Show him in, Higgins." Alistair entered, looking exactly as he always did, impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit, his brown hair neatly combed, his spectacles perched on his nose. He carried a leather-bound portfolio, no doubt filled with papers requiring her signature. He looked solid, real, and utterly ordinary. "Eleanor," he said, his voice its usual calm, measured baritone. "I trust you are recovering from the festivities?" He paused, his gaze sharpening as he took her in. "You look pale. Did you not sleep well?" There was a faint, almost imperceptible tension around his eyes. Was it concern? Disapproval? Something else? "I slept poorly," she admitted, gesturing for him to sit. "It was a long night." "Indeed," he said, taking the seat opposite her. He placed the portfolio on the table but didn't open it. His hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. They were capable hands with long, elegant fingers. She had never really looked at them before. It was a successful party by all accounts, though the masquerade element certainly caused a stir. Lady Pembroke was quite put out that she couldn't identify Lord Harrington until he unmasked. She'd been flirting with him quite shamelessly, thinking he was the new Viscount. He offered a small dry smile. It was the kind of anecdote he always shared, a mildly amusing observation on the foibles of their social circle. Normally she would have smiled back. Today it felt like a performance. "And you, Alistair?" she asked, her voice a little too bright. "Did you enjoy yourself? I don't believe I saw you after the first hour. What was your costume?" He adjusted his spectacles, a habitual gesture. "I was a Florentine scholar. Rather dull, I'm afraid. Brown robes, a book. I felt a bit of a fool, to be honest. I retired to the library for a bit of quiet and ended up discussing railway stocks with Lord Ashworth. He was the Roman emperor. A Florentine scholar. Brown robes. It was the most unassuming, unsexy costume imaginable. So utterly Alistair. The man in the conservatory had been darkness and danger and silent passion. Alistair was light and logic and quiet conversation. The two concepts could not be more opposed. Yet as he spoke, her eyes caught on his mouth, It was a well-shaped mouth, usually set in a firm, thoughtful line. She had never considered it before. But now she found herself studying the curve of his lower lip, the way it. She shook her head, dispelling the absurd thought. The lack of sleep was making her delirious. "Is something wrong, Eleanor?" Alistair asked, his gaze intent. "No, nothing," she said quickly, taking a sip of her cold tea. "I'm just tired. It was a strange night. Full of surprises." "Surprises can be unsettling," he said quietly. "The world is much easier to navigate when people are who they appear to be." There was a weight to his words that gave her pause. Was he referring to the party or to something else? She looked at him, truly looked at him, trying to see past the familiar facade of her late husband's best friend. He met her gaze steadily, but his eyes, those calm gray pools, seemed to hold a new, unreadable depth. For a fleeting, impossible second, the cadence of his speech, the stillness of his posture, echoed the man from the conservatory. "No," she told herself fiercely. "It is the memory playing tricks on you. You are projecting a fantasy onto the nearest safe, familiar man. Alistair Finch does not lurk in conservatories and kiss widows with devastating passion. He discusses railway stocks." "Indeed," she echoed, breaking the gaze and looking down at her hands. "Clarity is a virtue I am coming to appreciate more and more." He was silent for a long moment. "Shall we go over the quarterly reports from the northern estates? It might provide a welcome distraction." And just like that, the moment passed. The mysterious, passionate stranger receded back into the realm of fantasy, and the practical, predictable world of Alistair Finch reasserted itself. But the seed of doubt, tiny and tenacious, had been planted. And Eleanor had the unsettling feeling that nothing would ever be simple again. The days that followed were a torment. The vibrant, sensory memory of the kiss began to fade, replaced by a gnawing, obsessive curiosity. Eleanor found herself behaving like a detective in her own life, searching for clues. She questioned Higgins discreetly about who had been seen entering the conservatory. She revisited the guest list, circling the names of men who might possess the necessary height, the breadth of shoulder. She even found herself studying the men she encountered in her daily life, the vicar, the butcher, the banker, imagining them in a black gondolier's mask. The exercise was futile and faintly ridiculous. Her thoughts, however, kept circling back to Alistair. It was the most illogical, most infuriating possibility, and therefore the one her mind would not release. She began to notice things about him she never had before. The following Tuesday he arrived at precisely 4 o'clock. As he removed his overcoat and gloves, she watched his hands. The gondolier had worn simple, dark leather gloves. Alistair's were kid leather, tan in color. But was the size, the shape of his hand the same? She couldn't be sure. The memory was a blur of sensation, not visual detail. He joined her by the fire, and as he leaned forward to accept a cup of tea, she caught a faint, fleeting scent. Sandalwood and old books. It was his scent, Alistair's scent. But beneath it, was there a ghost of winter mint? Or was her mind, desperate for a connection, inventing it? "You seem preoccupied, Eleanor," he remarked, his gaze resting on her face with an unnerving focus. "Do I?" She forced a smile. "I suppose I am. I've been thinking of traveling." It was a lie, a deflection, but his reaction was immediate and intense. A muscle in his jaw tightened. "Traveling? Where?" "Italy, perhaps. Venice." She said the name deliberately, watching him. "It seems a city built for masks and mysteries." He carefully placed his cup and saucer on the table. The china made a precise, delicate click. "I see. And when were you thinking of departing?" "I haven't decided. Soon." "That would be unwise," he said, his voice low. "The estate matters are complex. The weather is treacherous for sailing. And to travel alone?" He trailed off, uncharacteristically flustered. "I am quite capable, Alistair," she said, a spark of her old defiance returning. "I am not a child to be managed." "I am not trying to manage you," he said, and for the first time she heard a raw edge in his voice, a flicker of emotion that was not calm reason. "I am trying to protect you." "From what?" "From life." The words tumbled out, fueled by weeks of frustration and confusion. "Arthur has been gone for 2 years, Alistair. I am tired of being the widow Blackwood, a statue in a mausoleum. I want to feel the sun on my face. I want to live." He stood up abruptly, turning his back to her to stare into the fire. His shoulders were rigid. "You think you are the only one living in a shadow?" he asked, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it. The question hung in the air, charged and profound. Eleanor's breath caught. What shadow did Alistair Finch live in? He was the most transparent, solid man she knew. Wasn't he? What does that mean? She whispered. He didn't turn around. It means that some of us wear our masks in the daylight, Eleanor. And they are far more difficult to remove. The conversation ended there. He made a vague excuse about a forgotten appointment and left shortly after, leaving Eleanor more unsettled than ever. His words echoed in her mind. Masks in the daylight. Was it a confession? A philosophical musing? Or simply a statement about the social constraints they all lived under? The duality was tearing her apart. By day, Alistair was her rock, her advisor, the man who spoke of stocks and estates. But in her mind, he was slowly merging with the gondolier, the silent, passionate figure who had awakened a part of her she thought had died with Arthur. She was living two lives, one in the cold light of reality and one in the heated memory of a single kiss. The breaking point came a week later, during a dinner party she had been coerced into hosting for a few of Arthur's distant cousins. It was a stilted, formal affair. Alistair was there, of course, seated to her right. He was the perfect guest, engaging the tedious cousin Matilda in conversation about watercolor techniques, his manners impeccable. Eleanor, however, was a live wire. Every time Alistair's sleeve brushed her arm, a jolt went through her. Every time he laughed, a low, warm sound she realized she cherished, she compared it to the gondolier's silence. The contrast was maddening. During a lull in the conversation, as the dessert was being served, the topic of the 12th night masquerade arose. "A thrilling idea, my dear," said Cousin George, a portly man with a fondness for port. "Though I must say, it made for a deuced awkward moment the next morning when I realized I'd insulted my own wife's hat thinking she was someone else." Polite laughter rippled around the table. "It was a night for mistaken identities," Alistair commented, swirling the claret in his glass. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular. "Indeed," Eleanor said, her voice tight. She decided to take a risk, a desperate ploy for a reaction. She turned to Alistair, a deliberately fond, teasing smile on her lips. "Why, I had my own little adventure. I shared a dance, and rather more, with a most mysterious gondolier in the conservatory. He was quite unforgettable." The table fell silent. A widow speaking of a clandestine kiss was scandalous, thrilling fodder. All eyes were on her, wide with shock and curiosity. But Eleanor only had eyes for Alistair. His reaction was not what she expected. He didn't flinch. He didn't blush. He didn't look shocked. He went perfectly, utterly still. The glass in his hand stopped moving. His face became a careful, neutral mask, but his eyes behind his spectacles were a storm. They locked with hers, and in their gray depths she saw not surprise, but a flash of something fierce, possessive and raw. It was the look from the conservatory. It was the gondolier's look. And then it was gone, smoothed away so quickly she wondered if she had imagined it. "How dramatic," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He took a slow sip of his wine, his hand perfectly steady once more. "I trust the gentleman was gallant." "He was," Eleanor said, her heart pounding a wild, triumphant rhythm against her ribs. She had her answer. The connection was not her imagination. The quiet, proper Alistair Finch and the passionate stranger were one and the same. The revelation was a seismic shock that rearranged her entire world. The rock upon which she had leaned for 2 years was not a rock at all, but a volcano, and she had just stumbled into its crater. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. Eleanor could barely form coherent sentences. The moment the last guest departed, she turned to Alistair, who was collecting his papers from the sideboard. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He simply nodded, his expression grim. The library. The library was the heart of Blackwood Manor, a room that held the ghost of Arthur in every leather-bound volume and in the worn armchair by the fire where he used to sit. It was the worst and best place for this confrontation. Eleanor closed the doors behind them, leaning against them for support. Alistair stood by the fireplace, his back to her, his head bowed. "It was you," she said. It wasn't a question. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Finally he spoke, his voice low and strained, stripped of its usual calm. "Yes." The single word, so simply admitted, was more devastating than any denial could have been. The air left her lungs in a rush. "Why?" she whispered. "Why the mask? Why the silence? Why that?" He turned to face her then, and the man who looked at her was a stranger. The careful composure was gone, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability she had never seen in him. His eyes were full of a torment that took her breath away. "Why?" he repeated, a bitter, broken laugh escaping him. Because for 10 years, Eleanor, I have loved you. She felt as if the floor had vanished from beneath her. What? I loved you from the moment Arthur brought you home, a bright, laughing thing that lit up this whole damned house, he said, the words pouring out of him like a flood breaking through a dam. But you were his. You were his sun, his moon, his joy. And he was my brother in all but blood. So I buried it. I became the friend. The dependable, boring Alistair. I stood at your wedding. I held your hand at his funeral. I have spent a decade watching the woman I love, loving another man and then mourning him. He took a step toward her, his hands clenched at his sides. The party, your masquerade. It was a temptation I couldn't resist. For one night, I wouldn't be Alistair Finch, the faithful friend. I could be no one. I could be a man, just a man who wanted to kiss the woman who had haunted his dreams for a decade. I thought if I could have just that one moment, I could finally let you go. I could be content with being your friend. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, hot and silent. Her mind was reeling, trying to reconcile this confession with the years of quiet, unwavering support. But I couldn't, he continued, his voice cracking. That kiss. God, Eleanor. It wasn't a release. It was a beginning. It ruined me. It made the pretense unbearable. Seeing you every day, knowing what it felt to hold you and having to go back to being him, it's been a special kind of hell. He gestured to himself, to his proper suit, his neat hair. This is my mask. The one I wear every single day. And after that night it started to crack. I couldn't bear the thought of you leaving for Venice, of you disappearing from my life just when I had finally touched you. Eleanor pushed herself away from the door, walking toward him slowly as one would approach a skittish animal. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture of a love so deep and so desperate it had hidden in plain sight for years. All this time, she breathed, I thought I was going mad. I was kissing a phantom, while the man I needed was standing right in front of me. The man you needed? He asked, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. I was grieving Arthur, she said, stopping just before him. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and gently removed his spectacles, placing them on the mantelpiece. Without them, his face was younger, more open, the intensity of his gaze undiluted. But I was also grieving for myself. For the woman who felt she had died with him. You didn't just kiss me that night, Alistair. You woke me up. You made me feel alive again. She raised her hand and cupped his cheek, mirroring his gesture from the conservatory. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a brief moment as if in prayer. I don't know who I am without the grief, she admitted softly. And I don't know what this is between us. It's complicated and messy and it would scandalize everyone. But for the first time in 2 years, the future doesn't look like an endless, gray corridor. It looks uncertain. And that feels like a gift. Alistair covered her hand with his own, pressing it against his face. Let me be part of that uncertainty, Eleanor. Not as your steward or your late husband's friend, but as the man who loves you. Let me try to love you in the daylight without the mask. Eleanor looked into the eyes of the man she had known for a decade and saw the stranger she had kissed in the moonlight. And she realized they were, and always had been, the same person. The steadfast friend and the passionate lover were not two different men, but two sides of a whole, profound and patient love. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. This kiss was different from the one in the conservatory. It was not a desperate, anonymous collision in the dark. It was a promise. It was slower, sweeter, filled with the weight of his confession and the tentative hope of her acceptance. It was a beginning, forged from the embers of a secret night and tempered in the honest light of day. When they finally parted, both were breathless. A slow, real smile, the first one she had seen that reached his eyes, spread across Alistair's face. It transformed him. It seems, Eleanor said, her voice laced with wonder, that the 12th night magic worked after all. It didn't just hide our identities. It revealed them. Outside, the winter night was cold and deep, but in the library of Blackwood Manor, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, two hearts that had been hiding in plain sight finally began to mend, forging a new future, one honest kiss at a time.